Good day, folks, and welcome to our Bible study this morning, this afternoon, whenever you get a chance to watch this. Welcome to my living room as we get a chance to look into God's Word today. Just a quick question for you. How long does it take you to decide what you're going to have when you go to a restaurant? Do you flip through? Do you look for something familiar? Do you look for something out there that you wouldn't eat normally? How long does it take you to decide? Is it any faster if you go to a fast food restaurant? I know when I go into Wendy's, it's automatic. I'll have a number 7, swap the fries for a Caesar salad, and away we go. My wife, on the other hand, as she goes into Wendy's, the menu has not changed in 50 years. She still has to study the menu and look at it several times before she can come up with what it is that she's going to have. You know, we have a world full of choices, and those choices can be small, medium, large. Do you want black, regular, double, or do you want a cruller or a fritter or Boston cream? We have all kinds of choices that we're confronted with and that we're asked about all the time. And we're going to look at some choices this morning. But first, I'd like to go through our text and just to get it all in perspective before we go off into the application, which I'd like to show us this morning. If you take your Bibles and go please to 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5, I'm just going to read the first 2 verses. It says, "But now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance into Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife." We see here that God had given Naaman now several victories over some enemies, including Israel. Now, why would God allow a guy from Syria, a Gentile, to defeat the Israelites in war? Wasn't Israel God's chosen people? Well, they were. They were, absolutely. But the king of Israel at this time, his name was Jehoram, and he was an evil king, all right? He was an ungodly king. His father was Ahab. He was an evil, ungodly king. His mother was an ungodly Jezebel. Even his brothers and everybody else in his family, they didn't want anything to do with God. And as he was the king of Israel, God was obviously putting his disciplining hand upon Israel, and he was using the Syrians at this time to accomplish his purpose here. All right, now, as we see here, we see Naaman, he was captain of the host of the king of Syria. He was essentially number 2 in Syria at this time. He only answered to the king, who at this time was Ben-Hadad II. All right, and here he is, and he's number 2 in the king, but he's got leprosy. Now, it seems if we were to look at verse 11, and we'll get down to that in a little bit, that the leprosy was at this point just in one area, and eventually it would spread, okay? But what he had here, and leprosy in those days was essentially a death sentence, all right? Now, they did not have all the laws that God had given concerning leprosy to the Israelites. It was different in Syria, and he was there with the king, and we see in some of the laws that God gave to the Israelites in Leviticus chapter 13. The whole chapter is devoted to the laws that God gave concerning someone if they had leprosy, or if there was leprosy in an item of clothing, or if there was leprosy in a house, and so forth. And the Bible never comes out and says that leprosy is the same as sin, but the way that it's described in the characteristics of leprosy, they are so very similar to sin. I'm just going to touch on some verses there, and you can go there if you'd like, or look up these verses after, but all through that chapter of Leviticus chapter 13, in verse 3, it says that leprosy goes deeper than the skin, just like sin. It's not just what we see on the top. Sin goes deeper than that. It's not just what we can see. And in verse number 7, it says that the leprosy spreads. It just doesn't, it's not, sin doesn't just happen once and it's over. that fella in that orthodontist in Nova Scotia that went out and killed all those people. He didn't just wake up one morning and decide to do that. There was sin after sin that had been building up to this point. It just does. It's not just. It spreads. Okay. And if we give it that leeway, if we give it that space, and we allow it into our lives, it will spread and affect other areas of our lives. All right. In verse 45. Leprosy defiles, just like sin defiles us, all right? In verse 46, leprosy, the people, when they got that leprosy, had to be isolated from everybody else, and sin isolates us. It isolates us from what is good and what is right. And in the end, in verses 52 and verse 57, leprosy is only good, just like sin, for fire. And that's where sin ends up in eternal fire. Okay, but moving on here, he had this leprosy, and we see here that there was a little maid that came out of Israel that they had captured. But in verse number 3, it says, "And she," speaking of this girl, okay, "and she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy." Now, this little maid, I would imagine that she was probably, because of what she's doing here, she is there to be the handmaid for this woman, okay, which happened to be Naaman's wife, and I would believe that she is probably in the neighborhood of about 12 years old. She's not a real little kid that would need to be babysat. That's not why they brought her here, okay? She's here to be a servant, but again, she's not fully grown to an adult state yet, because it does call her a little girl. So I think that she was probably 11, 12 years old, somewhere in that area, and she says this to her mistress, okay? "Would God my Lord," now that Lord there is a little L, that's talking about Naaman. God's talking about God, okay, capital G. "Would God my Lord," or would Naaman, "were with the prophet," that's Elisha, "in Samaria," that is in Samaria, "for he would recover him of his leprosy." Now this message finds its way all the way to the king, okay? And the king puts together a letter for Naaman to take to Israel, and he puts together 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. Okay, now to put that in some kind of perspective, I was reading in one commentary, and he kind of figured it out that it would be 750 pounds of silver. Not 750 ounces, but 750 pounds of silver. Now, right now, price of silver is down. It's around $16 an ounce or something like that. But there's many ounces in a pound, 16 ounces in a pound. These metal ones, there's I believe it's 20 in a troy ounce, 20 troy ounces. But at any rate, that's beside the point. We're talking a lot, okay? 150 pounds of gold and 10 changes of raiment. This is what you would class as a king's ransom, all right? You're going to take all this, and they're going to head out, okay, to Israel. Now, the maid had said nothing about a payment. She had said, all that she had said was she had pointed her mistresses, pointed her towards Elisha, and told her mistress what God could do. But men wanted to put something else with it. And the unsaved, which Ben-Hadad clearly was, an ungodly nation, they know nothing about God. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14, it says, "But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned." We only complicate things, all right? It's the same when man puts their own wisdom with things. It's just like salvation. They say it just can't be that simple, like childlike faith and accepting Jesus, accepting that Jesus is God, that he came and he lived on the earth and he was sacrificed in our place, that he died and that he rose again to pay our debt for sin, and that we need to humble ourselves before him, knowing that he's the only one that could pay for our sin. It can't be that simple. It can't be that simple. No, we need to complicate it. There has to be something else with it. We have to do some good works. We have to be baptized. That's something we can physically do in order to get saved. That's not what the Bible says. Or they say, we have to do something to make ourselves to that place where we deserve salvation. My friend, nobody deserves salvation, ever. All right? No one. And it is a gift of God. So they brought all this wealth. And we'll see later as we get on in the biblical account here that Elisha refused the wealth. He refused any of it because all of the glory for what was going to happen here had to go to God. It had to go to God for what was happening here. So Naaman comes and he's got some people with him. But he comes with all this gold and silver and stuff, and he brings the letter. And he brings the letter and he gives the letter to Jehoram. And he looks at this letter. All right, and let's look at verse number 6. It says, and in 2 Kings, chapter 5, verse 6, it says, and he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. And the king goes, what? And he rents his clothes, all right, and he says, am I God to kill and to make alive? What is he doing here? What is he trying to pick a fight? He's trying to make war here. Look at this. How can I heal a man from leprosy? Ben-Hadad thought that he's going to know right away that he needs to send him to the prophet. That's what this little maid had told. But the king's not. The last person that the king is thinking about is Elisha. Actually, he'd be the second last. The last one he's thinking about is God. All right? Even though he says here, am I God? All right? He just, it's the furthest thing from him. All right? Elisha gets the message, hears about the message. He hears what is said, he hears about this letter, he hears what the king has said. All right? Word gets around fast, and Elisha sends a message. I don't know if he sent his servant Gehazi or he sent someone else, but he sends a message to him, and he says to him, all right, verse number 8, and it was so when Elisha the man of God had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. There's a prophet. There is a man of God in Israel, and he's going to know it, okay? So Naaman comes, and he brings his men, and they come to the door of Elisha's house, and Elisha just sends a message. He doesn't come down to see him. It says that he's in a tower a little later, so I'm assuming he's upstairs, all right? And he sends a message to him, and the message, and it's more than likely Gehazi. That's his servant who's there. We'll see a little bit more about him in a minute. But he sends a message down, and the message is simply in verse number 10 there. It says, and Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. Thou shalt be clean. Naaman is livid. The guy's got leprosy, okay? He's traveled a long way to come here, and he's given a simple task to do, and he is absolutely livid about this. He says he should have come down himself. He should call on the name of his God, and he should put his hand over the spot of leprosy, and then I could be healed. That's how he's supposed to do it, all right? You know, my rivers back in Syria are way better than these dirty rivers that they have here in Israel, and he is just fit to be tied. This is how he should have done it. You know, again, it's like people who have a better way for God to provide salvation. God needs to do it my way. You know, do we ever think that God needs to do things differently? You know, we think, that person over there, they should be disciplined. God should be disciplining that person over there. Or, you know, I shouldn't have to go through this thing that I'm going through. Why? God needs to do things differently. And that's what Naaman was saying here. This prophet needs to do things differently. You know, call on the name of his God, put his hand over the spot, and then I'd be healed. I'm not washing in that dirty river. And off he storms. Okay? One of his servants had to start this thing. It says that his servants came to him. So there's at least 2 of his servants come to Naaman, and they say, look at master. If he'd have asked you to do something big or something hard, wouldn't you have done that? Why won't you just do this simple thing and dip in this Jordan River 7 times? We've come all this way. And finally he says, okay, I'm going to do that. Now the Jordan River was not that close to where they were. It was several miles away, okay? So he goes to the river and he gets down and he dips himself in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, nothing's happened. When he dips himself in the 7th time, he comes up, his flesh is whole. That leprosy is totally gone. And he gets excited. He doesn't just get excited that his leprosy is gone, okay? And I'm going to show you this because it is really neat. He comes back, miles and miles and miles back to see Elisha, all right? And he returns to the man of God. Look at verse 15. It says, and he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and came and stood before him, and he said, doesn't talk about his leprosy. This is cool. Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. You know what? There is no other God. This is coming from a place where they have multiple gods that they would worship and idols and so forth that they would worship. And he says, I know there is no other God anywhere except this God that's healed me through you, okay? And he says, I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. I brought all this stuff, 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, 10 changes of raiment. I want you to take this. And Elisha says in verse 16, as the Lord liveth, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. As we noted earlier, Elisha was only interested in God profiting with any glory with this. It had nothing to do with him. Could he have used the money? Sure he could. He was very poor. Could he have even taken the money and used it in all the prophet schools that he went to for the needs that were there? Absolutely he could have done that. But it was more important to give God this glory than to cover some bills or to profit himself. And Naaman, he promises that he will never offer anything to any other God. And then there's kind of a little different verse, and I'd just like to look at it briefly. In verse number 18, he says, well, let me read verse 17 first, okay? And it says, and Naaman said, shall there not then, I pray thee, be given to thy servant 2 mules burden of earth, for thy servant will henceforth offer neither burnt offering nor sacrifice unto other gods, but unto the Lord. In this thing the Lord pardon thy servant, verse 18 says, that when my master goeth into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leaneth on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow down myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon his servant of this thing. And we think, well, why would Elisha let him do that? God says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. All right. I want you to understand something really quickly here that I believe, anyway, with Naaman, he says, I'm not going to make a sacrifice to any other God. You know what? If we were to put it in and say that, he's just been converted, all right, it's been hours, maybe a day to come back. He is a brand new convert. And you know what? God's going to work on his heart on these things. He's already says, I'm not going to serve any other gods. And I think things will change when he goes back. And one of the reasons that I think that God healed him, aside from the fact that he's proving the faith of this little girl, was even though this was one of those heathen nations, God wanted to reach those people. That's why God didn't destroy the people. He kept giving them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to come back to him. All right. And Naaman, I think, went back, and I'm sure that he was telling others about the God of Israel. And other people were falling in love with God because of the things that Naaman was saying, okay? But at any rate here, okay, we know that Gehazi, he thought that Elisha had blown it here. He'd blown an opportunity to let this Gentile off scot-free. He let him go scot-free, all right? And so he says, you know what? I'm going to get some of this stuff. So he runs off after everybody. Elisha goes back into his house, and Gehazi goes in there probably with them, and then they go down the road a little ways, and he's thinking about this, and then he goes off after them, and he flat out lies. And I want to show you something else here that's very unique. As he's approaching, they see that he is coming, and what does Naaman do? Remember now, he is number 2 in all of Syria. This is a high up guy. He is probably very wealthy. He is honored by many people. Gehazi is a servant. What should he do? He should wait there until the servant comes. He doesn't. He's a changed man. He gets down out of his chariot and comes up to meet him and says, "Is all well? What's happening here? You look like you're in a hurry," and so forth. And Gehazi says, "Well, 2 sons of the prophets came down here," and Elisha says, "Can you please give us, a talent of silver and 2 changes of raiment, of that stuff that you have here?" Well, Naaman has no reason to doubt what Gehazi is saying is true, although there's no truth in it at all. And Naaman says, "Well, yeah, you don't just take 1 talent, take 2 talents. Now, these talents are like 75 pounds each, just 150 pounds. He says, "I'm going to get 2 of my servants to help carry this back with you." Okay? And the 2 servants go back and they carry this stuff back, and Gehazi goes into the house, and he hides this stuff. Kind of reminds you of Achan, doesn't it? When he hides the stuff in his house there. And Elisha asks him, he says, "Where did you go, Gehazi?" After the people leave. And he says, I didn't go anywhere. You know what? This reminds me of Peter and Ananias and Sapphira. How he asked them, what did you give? "Well, we sold the land for this much." Are you giving the whole amount here? "Yeah, we're giving the whole amount." "Yeah. See that guy's feet at the back door? He's going to carry your dead body out of here." Poof, over he goes. But it just reminds me of that as Elisha's there saying to Gehazi, he says, "Gehazi, where did you go?" He goes, "I didn't go anywhere." He said, "Do you think that my heart didn't go with your heart when you went there?" And Naaman got out of his chariot and came back to meet you. He says, is it time? Verse 26 says, "Is it time to receive money and to receive garments and olive yards and vineyards and sheep and oxen and men servants and maid servants?" He says, "You know what? The leprosy that Naaman had, it's going to come back to you." And Gehazi looked at himself, and he just didn't have 1 spot on him. He's covered in leprosy. And he went out of there, and he was no longer Elisha's servant. I count about 9 characters that we've looked at in this biblical account here. All right? And I'm going to give them to you in, like they do in some movies, in order of appearance. Okay? And I want you to pick out the one you think I'm going to talk about. So you can talk it over with the people that are with you there, or just off your own. Just a fun little thing here, okay? 9 characters in the order of this in the Bible. Naaman, Ben-Hadad II, the little maid, Mrs. Naaman, Jehoram, Elisha, Gehazi, and at least the 2 servants. There's 9 people. So I'll give you just a second here. You ready? Do, 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 do. Okay. You know what we're going to talk about? The little girl. What little girl? The little maid. What do you mean little? It doesn't even give her name. But we're going to talk about this little maid. Why would this little girl say that God could heal Naaman through Elisha? Why would she say that? Had she heard about Elisha cleansing lots of Israelites of their leprosy? No, she had not. Had she seen Elisha before she was taken away as a slave, as a captive? Would she seen Elisha heal someone from leprosy? No, she had not. Now you're saying to me, well, Brother Taylor, maybe she didn't, and it's just not recorded in the Bible. That's possible. And under normal circumstances, I would say you are right. It's possible there could have been something that happened that is not recorded in the Bible, and that's what happened here. But you know what? That is not what happened here. Take a look in your Bibles, if you will, to the New Testament in Luke chapter 4 and verse 27. This is Jesus talking. It is fact, okay? And he said, "And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Eliseus, who is Elisha, the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, saving Naaman the Syrian. There were no others that were healed by Elisha other than Naaman the Syrian. Just as a little side note here, Elijah is mentioned 29 times in the New Testament. Elisha, this is it, his only time, his only appearance in the New Testament. So this girl says that Elisha could heal him God would heal him through Elisha. All right? Would God? All right? Why would she think that? Okay? Why would she say that? Let's just back up a little bit further. I want you to think about this little girl and how she got into this situation, okay? Look at verse 2. It says, "And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife." They brought her away captive. This is not, here's your slice of pizza, your bag of chips, and your can of pop. Hop on the bus, and we're going to take you to camp, okay? That is not what happened here. She was led away captive. At best, she was put in a crowded wagon full of a whole bunch of other captives, but more than likely, what she was done is they were tied together, and they were put in a group with soldiers all around them, and they walked all the way back to Syria. They were herded up, okay, like cattle, and walked miles and miles and miles to get where they were going, okay? She did not ask to be here. She didn't want to be here. She couldn't go home to her mom ever. Think about it. This little girl, what she was, a captive and a slave, was not her choice. But who she was, a caring, God-trusting, God-representative young girl, was her choice. That was her choice. You know what? We always have a choice about our attitude. You know, we can focus on the shortcomings of life. Like, you know, I can't go anywhere right now. I can't do the things that I want to do. I want to go to church. We haven't been to church now, and I think it's 9 weeks. Okay? And I can't do that. And I have to teach Sunday school talking to my iPad. I don't want to do that. I'd rather look at some faces out there. All right? We can look at our situation like that, or we can focus on the mercies of God and the blessings of God. You know what? Through this means of technology that we have, we can still go to church. We can still at least study God's word together. We can still call one another afterwards and talk about God's word. We may not be able to go and see people right now, but, you know, there's so much that we can be thankful for. You know, we always have a choice. Why did this little kid, think about this, why did they take this kid serious? How serious? 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, 10 changes of raiment, taking number 2 guy in the whole kingdom and sending him into enemy territory with a letter saying, "Heal me." Why would they take her so serious that this could really be true? You know what? Clearly, this attitude that this young girl displayed was something that she had displayed over and over again. This wasn't a first-time thing. This was a natural reaction because that's the attitude she chose. Her choice was like my ordering at Wendy's. I'll have a number 7, swap the fries for a salad, the Caesar salad. All right. It was automatic for her. But it was her choice as to what she was like. Her attitude is her choice. Your attitude, my attitude, it's a choice that we have. We always have a choice about our attitude. I really think that this little girl, there's only a couple of verses that talk about her. It doesn't give her name, doesn't give her parents' name. It just basically, there's a couple of verses in all of God's word to be preserved forever, by the way, that mentions this little girl, but I really think she was just like Joseph. Coat of many colors, Joseph. When he was in Potiphar's house, he was a slave. He couldn't go where he wanted to go, but he was made in charge of everything in that house before Mrs. Potiphar ruined the whole story for him. But at any rate, I think that's what this little girl was like, okay? She was very much like Joseph. Trusted, believed. 750 pounds of gold, 750 pounds of silver and 150 pounds of gold. That's some trust, all right? We always have a choice about our attitude. We always have a choice about God's prominence in our life. God was prominent in this young girl's life. Many of you know, at least all the people from our church know that I used to be a firefighter, professional firefighter for 36 years. But I was told before I went to the fire hall by someone that I knew that worked there, and they said to me, you know what? You can't bring God into the fire hall. I looked at them, what do you mean? God comes with me everywhere. You can't bring him into the fire hall. I brought him into the fire hall. They knew where I stood. I didn't walk around all day carrying my Bible, although I did have my Bible there. And frequently we would often, okay, and frequently might be exaggerating some, but often, the people would ask some questions and so forth, and we could sit up late at night, and I'd go get my Bible. Actually, a funny story about that. There's a little bit of clowning around that happens at the fire hall, all right? And we were at the fire hall next to the hospital there, and we were swapping crews. And the one fellow that was there was really worried because he pulled some pranks on some of these guys that were coming up, and he was worried they were going to get into his locker and pull some pranks on him. And unbeknownst to myself, what he did was he went into my locker first, and he took my Bible out, and he put it in his locker, thinking that, well, they'll open the locker, see the Bible, think, oh, this is Taylor's locker, and they'll keep looking and won't find his locker. And it worked for a little bit, but then the guys figured it out, and they still sabotaged his locker. But you know what? You have a choice as to where you put God in perspective here, okay? You can hide the fact that you're a Christian, or you can show others, that he only has a secondary place. I go to church when I'm not too busy, or if there isn't something that's more important to do. But God, you just don't want to be labeled, all right? But we always have a choice of God's prominence or God's disguise somewhere that's in our life. But we have a choice. We have a choice. We always have a choice about our attitude. We always have a choice about God's prominence in our lives. And we always have a choice to share or not to share God with others. This little girl was more than willing to share her God. She was more than willing to believe that God could do what she had never seen done before. She'd never seen anybody healed from leprosy before. She'd never heard of God doing that before. Not through Elisha. And yet she knew that God would do that. And she was more than willing to share God, you ready for this? With her captors. These are the captors that are keeping her from her family. She's more than willing to share God with them. She made the choice to be like Joseph, even though she was much younger than Joseph was. And she was never, ever going to be anything more than just a servant girl. She made a choice to be whatever she could be for her God. How about your choices? Are they anything like this sweet little servant girl whom we don't even know her name? How about your choices? We always have a choice about our attitude. We always have a choice of where God's prominence is in our lives. Number 1, number 2, number 52. And we always have a choice to share or not to share our God with others.